So, Paul,
Luke.
so you've got this enormous volume of your trilogy. How does that feel?
Well, I have mixed feelings about it, I have to say. A part of me is, of course, pleased that anyone would want to do this. And then the other part of me feels that probably I'm already dead. This is the kind of thing they do for, I look at the list of this wonderful publishing company, which emanates out of Paris. I think they have an office here, Saint-Père Publishers, SP Publishers. On the list is Voltaire. On the list is Mozart and Victor Hugo and Flaubert. Among Americans, I know there's The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald. And so to be in this company, of course, is stirring, but it feels a bit unreal. And I haven't really come to grips with it, I have to say.
So these are your first three works of fiction that are. So tell me a bit about the background there. When did you come to write these, and what was the experience?
Well, the background is rather long and rather complex. As you did, I went to Columbia College in New York. Luc followed me by, I don't know, half a decade at least. But we both were in that funny place on Morningside Heights. And I was a student there from 65 to 69. And I was writing poetry, always writing poetry, but also writing prose, fiction. And I think always my burning ambition was to be a novelist. But during those undergraduate years, I think I wrote about anywhere from 700 to 1,000 pages of fiction. 2 or 3 or 4 different long novels that I could never finish because I was too young and I had bitten off far more than I could chew. But embedded in some of those projects were certain ideas and certain passages even that later I plundered and used in later books that I wrote. So there was this big book I was trying to write when I was 19 and 20, which is weirdly a kind of combination between City of Glass and Moon Palace, if this is understandable, probably not. And many of the things that wound up in City of Glass later, more than a decade later, were written when I was 20 or 21. Certain things in City of Glass, for example, the idea of footsteps being tracked in a city street, and that when you look at the trajectory, you see that they're spelling out letters of the alphabet. Well, that was something from way back. There's a long conversation in the novel about Don Quixote. Well, that was something I wrote at 20. And when I finally got back to trying to do fiction, which was in the very, very early 1980s, 80, 81, I went looking through those old notebooks and found things that I used again. So it was really a very slow, long haul. So I wrote City of Glass in around 1980, 81. And then I didn't know it was part of a trilogy until I was about 2/3 of the way through. And then I thought, what I'm doing here, it reminds me of something I wrote back in the mid-70s, a little play, which was called Blackouts. And I never liked the play. It was a one-act play. But I thought, if I rework this play as a piece of prose, it might work well with this thing I'm doing, City of Glass. And that became the little pivot novel in between called Ghosts. And that comes directly out of stuff I wrote in the mid-'70s. And then, once I had two, I knew there had to be a third. And The Locked Room, the third, really was something new. It didn't rely on anything that I had done earlier. So I finished City of Glass, and I tried to get it published. And we were talking about this at dinner. It was turned down by 17 publishers in New York. Nobody wanted it. It was too strange for them. It wasn't that people told me that it was bad. They just thought it was too weird, and that it wouldn't sell, that it had no commercial potential whatsoever. And there were a number of publishers who were quite enthusiastic and said, gee, if you could only change the end, then maybe we would consider publishing it. But of course I wasn't interested in that. I mean, I had written my book the way I wanted to write it, and the idea of changing it just in order to be published seemed to be something worse than jumping off the edge of a cliff. So what I learned during this year and a half of having no publisher for it was that, well, first of all, I went on and I wrote the second book, and I was into the third when the first was finally published. What I understood was this, that I wasn't writing to make money, I wasn't writing to get published, I wasn't writing to be famous, I was simply writing because I needed to write. And I was perfectly resigned at that point to living out my life as an unpublished writer who would, of course, in my fantasies, leave behind a cache of manuscripts in a closet that would, of course, be published after I was dead and reveal the great genius people had ignored for all that time. But eventually, and here's the great irony, there was a small publisher out in Los Angeles, Sun and Moon Press, and he liked it. And but this was a man named Douglas Messerly, who was publishing forward-looking work, and he liked it. And then I told him, well, there are actually two more. He said, so much the better. And so he signed on for all three books. So the irony being that the New York Trilogy was published in Los Angeles. Yeah.
Never a prophet in one's own country.
Yeah, you can't win, right? You can't win. And now they're published in 45 different languages around the world. So the other lesson that I learned was don't listen to what publishers say, because they don't necessarily know that much. It's made me a great cynic from the very beginning. I see my editor, Barbara Jones, there, and Barbara, you are a vast exception to these rules. And I enjoy working with Barbara immensely, I have to say. But by and large, nobody knows anything. As William Goldman said about Hollywood, the recently departed William Goldman, well, the same holds with publishing.
So in case you all haven't looked at this fantastic object that's being promoted tonight, it's a combination of reproductions of holograph and typescript, two words that may disappear from the language soon enough. Do you still write by hand?
I do. I don't know why, but I could never feel comfortable writing with my fingers on a keyboard, whether a typewriter or a computer. I suppose it's just because I learned how to write with a pencil and then a pen in my hand, and that felt to be the natural way of writing. It's just an idiosyncratic quirk of mine. I'm not extolling this as the way to do it. It's just what works for me. And holding a pen in my hand, I somehow feel that the words are coming out of my body. It's a very physical process. I'm scratching the words onto a piece of paper, and I'm intimately, physically connected with the process. So the way I tend to work is in notebooks, and I work long and hard on each paragraph. And I can rewrite a paragraph twice, 3 times, 7 times, however long it takes. And once it feels to be more or less finished, I then wheel around and type it up on my old manual typewriter. So I can look at it clean. And then I attack that page and start making more corrections. And then once I've exhausted, for the moment, all the possibilities, I put that typed and scribbled over page in the pile of typed and scribbled over pages, and then I go back and write the next paragraph in the notebook. It's a weird way to do it, but that's how I do it. Yeah.
Sounds pretty traditional, really. I can't do it because I get hand cramps, but that, you know, actually City of Glass, the manuscript there looks so clean.
But you know, I think this is the problem. My papers are in the New York Public Library at the Berg Collection. And I kept changing the titles of these books. They all went through different titles. And so I think when the first person who got my papers started classifying them, they were put in different sections. I don't think they realized that they were all the same book. It was the same book with different titles. And so when the SP people came to New York, this has been going on for years. It must have been 5 or 6 years ago that this thing started. We went to the archive and we started looking for different manuscripts, but we could never find all of them. I never got to see everything because I know they went through multiple drafts. And what we wound up taking were different versions of each book along the way. I think that City of Glass one was very close to the end. And I think, for my own sake, I think I just copied out what I had. And that's why the handwriting is so neat for most of it. The Ghosts manuscript, well, that's the typescript. And then, and it was also at a fairly late stage of composition, but you see that there are all kinds of hand corrections in it as well. And then the last one, The Locked Room, I have no idea when that comes from. There it was, and it seemed to be so strangely repetitive that it was probably a earlier working out process. So we thought that might be interesting. And so we kind of threw the thing together. I mean, this book could have been done in 52 different ways, but this is what we chose.
Swell. It's such an Upper West Side specific thing. Do you ever go back up there and walk those streets?
Once in a while, but it's all different now. It's almost unrecognizable. I was up there last June, early June. A strange thing. Columbia, our old college, invited me to give a reading to the 50th reunion class, the class of 68, which is strange because I was class of 69. But because I had written this new book, 4321, in which there's some things about Columbia in it, and especially the chaotic events of 68 are discussed. So they thought maybe it would be interesting for me to do that. And I went back to Columbia, which was a strange experience. I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel miserable. I was somewhere in a dazed zone of disassociation, I think. But just walking around the neighborhood, it's nothing the way it was back in the 60s. It was beginning to fall apart. And then, and after I graduated, I stayed around another year. I got an MA at Columbia too. And then after doing various jobs like 1970 census taker in Harlem, and and then working on an oil tanker for about 6 months, you know, in the Gulf of Mexico, saving up enough money to move to Paris, which is what I wanted to do, where I thought I would stay for a year, but stayed almost 4. So I got back to New York in 1974 and moved back into that neighborhood. And it was still terrible. It was falling to pieces. Remember, 75 was the year of the New York City default. So it was even worse in 74 than it had been in 70. You know, the famous New York Daily News headline, Ford to City, drop dead. Well, that was 75. So I was there for another 2 years or so. And it's really, I think, that New York, which became grafted onto the particularly City of Glass. That's it. Because that's the only novel that is set in that neighborhood. Ghost is set in Brooklyn, and The Locked Room is mostly farther downtown in Chelsea. But the first one is up there in Morningside Heights. And it's been gentrified. It's a new place, as is so much of New York City in general.
Sure. Yeah, and it makes me think of, I mean, it was, you know, there was a lot that was terrible about the city, but that world of residential hotels where the old guy is living in one of them, and thinking about, you know, your piece about, or something you wrote about Harold Humes.
Yes, yes.
And the great
Doc.
You know, Doc Humes, and I, you know, just recently thinking about Louis Wolfson.
Yes.
Of these, well, he didn't live in a residential hotel, but
no.
You know, this kind of this New York of these wandering, eccentric, weirdo scholars seems to.
Well, it's just you need too much money to live in New York
Yeah.
now, so that these marginal characters, there's no room for them anymore. I mean, I remember during those years up on Morningside Heights, there was a place on 110th Street, a very tall building, the tallest in the neighborhood. It was called the Hotel Harmony. And on the side of the building it said, Hotel Harmony, where living is a pleasure. and I mean, the most scrofulous down and outers were living in this place. But living was a pleasure at the Hotel Harmony. Doc Humes I met in '69, and you probably don't know who he is. H.L. Humes was one of the founders of the Paris Review. He was a brilliant writer who published 2 extraordinary novels. One very fat, this big, Underground City, in the late '50s, and then a much shorter one, Men Die. And he was really somebody special, but he went over the edge. He got crazy, and at some point in the late '60s, his father died. He had been a physicist at Princeton, the father, and Doc inherited something like $15,000, and he decided that if he gave away the money in $50 increments to strangers on the street, he could destroy the United States economy. It would bring down the whole capitalist system. And I happened to meet him with a bunch of my friends. We had gone down to Times Square area. I think we went to some spaghetti western, a Sergio Leone film. And then we walked into a bar, and there was Doc, sitting there, listening to music being played. And one of my friends recognized him, and he was very happy to meet us. And I remember we walked from 42nd Street up to 115th Street, 4 or 5 of us. It was one of the craziest walks I've ever been involved in. He talked to everybody. and he was giving him money away. Every time he gave a 50, he'd say, "Spread a little sunshine." And then he'd say, "But you have to spend it as fast as you can. If you don't spend it, it's not going to work. But if you spend it, it's going to be like a rubber ball bouncing against walls, the brick walls, and it'll go so fast after a while. It'd be like atoms bouncing around, and pretty soon the walls will crack, and the whole building will tumble down." So then the fatal moment came when he said, "Any of you guys got a place to crash?" And I said, yeah, you know, you can stay. I have there's a couch in my apartment. You can stay on that. "Okay, man, thanks." And he talked like a real old-time hipster. So I thought it would be for one night, but he stayed for about 3 weeks, and it became intolerable. It was right at the end of my final semester as a senior. And I did want to graduate, and because I had done 4 years of work, and I had all these papers to write at the end. And he just wouldn't get off the sofa. He was smoking marijuana the whole time and eating pizza. That was what he did. Plus, when the word got out that he was there, the bell was ringing, because every undergraduate wanted to sit at Doc's feet. I listened to him discourse on the future of the world, and I said, "Look, I'm going to go. I go back to my mother's apartment in Newark. I'm going to write my papers, but I really need to do them. And then, I'm sorry, but you have to leave, because I can't do this anymore." He said, "Man, it's okay, man. It's cool. It's cool." And it's true. I stayed away for about 10 days, and when I got back, he was gone, and the place was neat as a pin. And I've always loved him, I have to say. But it was just impossible for me to, bear up to this, given, it was a tiny place. There were 2 rooms, and that was it. So now Doc is long dead, but his daughter, Imi Hume, did a wonderful documentary about him, maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago, and I recommend everyone see it. It's terrific. Wow. She won prizes for this documentary.
Yeah, I got to Columbia in '72, and he was still a lingering legend. I think he'd been expelled from a dorm room in John Jay like a year or 2 earlier, and still had disciples among the student body.
I'm sure. But he landed at Planet Columbia in '69, in the spring of '69, and so he probably was hanging around there for 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What this has to do with anything, I don't know, but it's interesting, isn't it? Yes.
I'm a terrible interviewer, so I'm just what are you working on now?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's something that I know you're interested in. I'm doing something new, something altogether new. I'm not writing a novel. I'm not writing an autobiographical work. I'm not writing a poem or an essay. But I'm writing a book about Stephen Crane, his life and work, both, sort of equally the two. And how many have read Stephen Crane in this room? Raise hands. So, only a few. Okay. You see, that's why I'm writing the book. Stephen Crane, to me, is one of the great American writers we've ever had. He had a very short life. He died at age 28 in 1900. But for some reason, this writer, whom everyone read in high school when I was a kid, I don't know if you did. Did you? No? I read him later. Well, in my high school, everyone read The Red Badge of Courage, and most kids throughout the United States read The Red Badge of Courage for a long, long time, and now it's fallen off the required list. and children are not reading him anymore, and they're not discovering him. And Crane has become a creature of academics and universities, and he's a classic, not read much. So I think I'm driven by this great desire to resurrect him, because he is our first modernist. He changed American literature forever. And without Crane, well, there's no Hemingway without Crane, first of all, but there's a lot of people without Crane. And his life was so short. It was like a meteor, flying across the sky, and boom, he burned out. And he wasn't around long enough to make a deep impression. Well, it's time for us to reassess him. So I've been at this now for more than a year. I feel I have at least another year to go. And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But that's what I'm doing. And there...
He's the first great American writer born in Newark.
That's right. He's from Newark, as am I. And so there are several of us born in Newark. He also was a terrific baseball player, something I spent my youth doing. Stephen Crane, it's interesting. He was the 14th of 14 children of a Methodist minister father. Yes, as you say, born in Newark in 1871. So all his siblings were much older, and he had one of his older brothers, who was about 18 or 19 years older, was a newspaper man, and he ran a news syndicate and press service in Asbury Park, New Jersey, which was a big, big popular resort at the time in the late 19th century. And so Crane, when he was a teenager, started working for his brother, and he was writing articles, at 15, 16. And he really trained there. That's how he got to be a writer. And he went to college for 1 year only. A semester at Lafayette, a semester at Syracuse, which his great uncle had helped found. It was a Methodist school in the beginning, where all he did was play on the baseball team. He became the captain, and he enrolled for one class. And then he quit, and he went down to Asbury Park in New York to become a writer. He was 19. He lived till he was 28, so he had 9 years. And in those 9 years, the collected works are 10 volumes. He wrote journalism, he wrote short stories, he wrote novels, he wrote poems, he covered 2 wars. He probably wrote about 60 or 70 war dispatches from the Greco-Turkish War in Greece and the Spanish-American War in Cuba and Puerto Rico. He's a demon writer, and I don't regret having gotten myself into this. And I'm determined to, carry it through to the end. But I'm not someone who's done this kind of thing, and I'm teaching myself how to do it as I do it. Yeah. And see, Luc did a collection, one of the paperback selections of Crane, some of the New York writings. One of the Modern Library, maybe, or not Penguin, but somebody.
Modern, I think it was Modern Library.
Modern Library.
Yeah.
So because of course, Luc has written about 19th century New York eloquently and thoroughly. And so, Crane is, I've read your works, of course, and Crane pops up from time to time in those books.
And I'm eager to read your book, because as we were talking, part of my knowledge of Crane's life comes from this fantastically readable and quotable book about Crane by Thomas Beer from the 1920s, which turns out to have been completely made up.
Yeah,
it's
a falsified. Beer did his best, but it wasn't good enough, and he was so frustrated not to be able to find out more about Crane's life that he started inventing girlfriends of women's who never had existed. He wrote letters to Crane from people who had never existed. He wrote letters from Crane that had never been written by Crane, and it made up many, many anecdotes. And Beer's book, which, give him credit, started the revival of interest in Crane, because after Crane died in 1900, he fell off the map, and Beer's book brought him back. But Beer's, false information dominated, I don't know, maybe about 65 years of Crane biography and scholarship. It's only lately that, really assiduous academic researchers have culled through everything and figured out what's true and not true.
So did Crane write that line that he quotes, which is, an artist, I think, is nothing but a powerful memory that can move itself through certain experiences sideways? You know that one?
No, I don't think he wrote that. Yeah, yes,
Oh, well.
yeah.
I'm just gonna consider that he wrote it anyway because I like it. Yeah.
But he is the first modern writer that we have.
Mm-hmm.
He had a whole new way of looking at language, a whole new way of looking at reality, and a whole new way of expressing all this, and no sentimentality whatsoever. And he was writing in what was probably the most sentimental age we've ever experienced.
Yeah. Wow. And so you're going to be ready with this in about a year, you say, something like that?
I hope so. A year, 14 months. I don't know. We'll see. The Lord willing, we'll see.
I don't know. Should we take questions from the
Maybe
audience?
just a few. Yeah. We've talked for half an hour. That's enough, and there's still some time. So let's open it up. No hands.
Well, gee.
Who were my influences when I was young? Boy, it's a long list of writers that I cared about. How young are we talking about? High school. Well, I did like Stephen Crane a lot in high school. But I think the writers that I first was attracted to, these are prose writers, not poets. I think the big ones who made big impression on me were first Hemingway, because I'm not a big fan of Hemingway, to tell you the truth, except some of the short stories. But the thing about Hemingway for a young person is this, that it's so artificial in a way. It is so worked over that, in a sense, Hemingway, for a naive young person, is the first writer who jumps out at you as that art is involved in making these sentences. That actually you're making decisions, and there's an approach about how to do this. And it's so blunt and clear in his work that it's a jolt to a young mind to confront this. And then it was Joyce. I fell in love with Joyce, who's I think a much greater writer, and those were the two. But there were lots of others. There were American writers that I really liked. Some of early John Dos Passos, Fitzgerald, Faulkner. I was reading them. Earlier than that, Sinclair Lewis I liked when I was about 14 and 15. All these other writers, but the two that marked me the most then were Hemingway first, and then Joyce. Yeah.
So I was wondering, from all over New York, why did you choose those specific three parts for the New York Trilogy? Was that Chelsea, Brooklyn?
Because those are places I knew. The Upper West Side, as Luc said, I knew well. The third book, the Locked Room. Well, Chelsea's in there. That's the neighborhood in New York, but it's really only an apartment. And there's very little about New York in the book. And then some of the most important chapters take place in New Jersey, where I grew up, and in Paris, where I lived. And then Ghosts mostly takes place on one street in Brooklyn Heights. And I was living in Brooklyn when I wrote it, and Orange Street. Orange Street is a fascinating street. It's the place where Walt Whitman set the type for Leaves of Grass. Orange Street is the street on which is located the, what's it called? The Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims, where Henry Ward Beecher was the minister. Beecher was a great abolitionist. Beecher was considered one of the great men of his time. His sister wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Harriet Beecher Stowe. So you go to that church on Orange Street. It's still there, very beautiful, and you see these bas-reliefs of, Abraham Lincoln, slaves, this whole abolitionist spirit. Everyone went to that church. Dickens came to hear Beecher speak. Thoreau was there. Lincoln was there. And I thought, this is a street of ghosts. And that's why the book is entitled Ghosts. So it's haunted 19th century Brooklyn. Down at the other end, Thomas Paine is buried at what would be the extension of Orange Street. So historically resonant. So I write about places I know. That's it. That's why.
What's the first word you set up translated?
Oh, that got translated? Poems back in the 70s in France. Yeah.
But do you have any input or did you translate it yourself?
No, I didn't translate it myself. I couldn't do that. For years, I made my living, or at least tried to, as a translator of French. But I can go from French to English, but English to French is, I could not do it at an acceptable level. It's too difficult. But there was someone right behind you. Yes.
Yes, could you tell us a little bit about what 4 years you spent in France or Paris?
Yes.
How old were you? What are some of the things you did?
Okay, I'll tell you. I first went to France after high school. I had saved up all my money, and I went to Europe for about 2.5 months. These were the days of, some of you are old enough to remember, Europe on $5 a day. Remember that? You could actually do it. You could do it. And I stayed in a hotel in Paris, for example. It cost $1.40 a night. And you could eat a meal that wouldn't make you sick for 20 cents, 25 cents. It was possible to do these things. So that was my first taste of Paris, and I was there for quite a while, maybe half the trip I spent there, and I made all kinds of interesting friends. I became fascinated with the place. And then, so when I went back later, I already knew it, and I could speak French well. And I was already, I'd finished college. I moved there right after my 24th birthday. So that was the early days of 1971. And 71. And so as I said, I thought I would stay for a year, but one thing leads to another, and I stayed longer. So for 2.5 years, I lived in Paris. I couldn't have a job. I was not legal. I mean, I was unemployable. So I had a bunch of freelance jobs, mostly translating, tutoring, ghostwriting, any number of odd things. I wound up translating the North Vietnamese Constitution into English because Mary McCarthy, the American writer, was there. She was a friend of one of my friends. They wanted someone to translate Vietnamese poetry. I had a most wonderful lunch with Mary McCarthy, who was married to a very wealthy businessman, Mr. West, and there were actually servants in the house. And she would ring a little bell when she wanted the next course. But she was terrific and awfully nice to me. And then the professor who was going to supervise this project went back to Vietnam, and it all fell through. And then 2 months later, a woman called me and said, "We hear you can translate from French to English." I said, "Yes." "Well, we have a job for you. Would you do it?" And I said, "Sure." And that was the North Vietnamese Constitution. I didn't get any money, but I got a free meal at a Vietnamese restaurant. And so I was really desperately poor, and I lived in a number of different apartments, sometimes with my girlfriend when we were on good terms, and then sometimes alone. And then when it looked as if the end had come and our money had completely run out, Columbia University has a building in Paris called Reed Hall. Does anyone know about Reed Hall? Yeah, a few people know about Reed Hall. So we happen to know the director of the place. He was an American journalist, very nice man, and he and his wife owned a house in the south of France, and in Provence, and it had been broken into a few times, and they wanted to have caretakers there, and so they hired us. And that's what we did. We went down into nowhere. I mean, it was really a remote place outside of a village that had a population of 40, in between vineyards, and with the national forest behind. And for 10 months, we lived there. And it was quite an extraordinary year, I have to say. I've never been so isolated. I don't think I ever wrote so much. And then we were also cranking out translations of books from French to English in order to eat, because our pay was, it was something like $50 a month. It wasn't very much. So when we finally had to leave that house, we came back to New York in July of 1974. I had $9 in my pocket, and that was it. And that's what I had to show for 3.5 years in France, $9. But I'd written some books. I was on my way, and there was no turning back. And I go back to France whenever I can. I love being there. Yeah. Well, I lived. The first apartment was in the 15th. The second apartment was I had a little maid's room in the first, and then there was a place in the 5th arrondissement, Rue Descartes. I liked that the best, but that's where we ran out of money again, and then went down to the south for that crazy job. More hands, yes.
We do have a microphone that I'll bring.
Could you talk a little bit about the connections between the 3 books in the New York Trilogy, or maybe more broadly speaking, why those 3 books go together?
She's asking why the 3 books go together. I don't know. They seem to resonate. It's not as if, I guess trilogies have the same characters, don't they? And you pick up the same story and take it out of later. Well, I guess I thought of this as a kind of triptych. And if there's some disjunction, well, fine, I didn't care. But they all belonged in the same realm, the same psychological realm, the same metaphysical realm, the same literary realm. I guess all the books are about questioning, you know, what is what, and who is who, and where is where. I mean, that's what those books are about. So they all go together, but not in any linear sense. There's a hand with a green sweater or shirt attached to it. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you always had like a clear flow as to which book or project comes next, or do you feel like the more personal ones, like The Invention of Solitude, was like looming on the horizon, and you need to do something at arm's length before you could get to that? How do you pick your projects in that sense? And is there like a big difference in the, let's say, intensity of work when you do like a book like Invention of Solitude?
Well, every book is intense, and every book takes the same effort, believe me, whether it's non-fiction, autobiographical work, or fiction. Writing is writing, and it takes a lot out of you. I don't pick my subjects, they pick me. And I wrote The Invention of Solitude immediately after my father dropped dead. A perfectly healthy man who had every indication of living to be 85 or 90 or even 100. A man who never smoked or drank or, you know, was sick a day in his life. He dropped dead at 66. And it was a big jolt. And I didn't know what to do. And I just sat down and started writing about him. And that led to the first half of that book. And then the first half of that book led to more things, and that became the second half. But they were separate books, the two parts. I can hardly see it. Yeah, the Portrait of an Invisible Man was one thing. And then I wrote the Book of Memory a little later. And there was a very tiny publisher of poetry. He was a friend of mine. And he wanted to do the first one. And then he didn't have any money. It took a long time. So by the time he was ready to do it, I had finished the second. He said, oh, I like that one too. And we decided, just to save money, that we would publish them in the same book. And then I thought, I need a title for the 10. And that's when I came up with The Invention of Solitude, but that was later. You know, everything is just living life and rolling with the punches, right? There's no master plan, I can tell you. Yeah.
We have time for one or two last questions.
All right, Peter.
You know, your books are read all over the world. Has the popularity in a particular country surprised you, or where are your audiences outside the States? And how is that satisfying to you? Speak about that.
That's an interesting question. Well, I'm pretty much published everywhere, as you understand, and I suppose my you know, the places where the books sell the most are in Western Europe, all through, you know, England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, etc. But that makes sense. These are the largest reading publics we have. But I think the most surprising thing is Turkey. Turkey is where I'm a big deal, and I don't know why. Every book I write it's 8 or 10 printings. So much so that I got into a big fight with their, you know, the dictator who runs that country, Erdogan. This has got to be now. Well, it's almost 7 years ago. I was just turning 65, so I remember I'm going to be 72 in February. So someone came from Turkey to interview me for a book that was coming out, and to Brooklyn, and we met in a cafe, and I said to her, she was a very nice young woman, I said, look, I want you to put in the article that the reason why I've refused invitations to Turkey is a political protest against Erdogan's policy of jailing writers and journalists. And I want you to put it in the article. And she did. And I figured that some pro-government columnist in a newspaper would attack me for this. But no, Erdogan himself got up in front of the country and said, Paul Auster is a stupid person, and I denounce him, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then I came back the next day, and I wrote something about free speech and defending people's right to publish what they want and to express themselves as they wanted, as the hallmark of a free society and a democracy. And it was published all over Turkey. And I've met since jailed Turkish journalists at the time who said when my thing was published in the newspaper, they started cheering in prison. I mean, this maybe is the most important thing that ever happened to me as a writer. But of course, Erdogan got up the next day and denounced me again as an enemy of the Turkish state and in cahoots with, who were the people then? Angela Merkel, Netanyahu, Sarkozy, and the Kurds, trying to topple the Turkish state. So my publisher's been great there. They dutifully and enthusiastically publish all my books, but I ain't going there, I'll tell you, because I think they'd lock me up in about 2 seconds. Yeah. Yeah. All right, one more and then we stop. Here.
Do you feel somehow that thanks. Do you feel somehow that you rediscover your work when you read it in another language, particularly in a language that you master, like French?
No, because I can't read any language but French, and so I can't. When I read it in French, it seems bizarre. And but I've had different translators over the years in France, and the last one for 4321, which is a 1,000-page book, I got the manuscript and I looked at it and I realized that it was terrible, and I spent a whole month, 10 hours a day for a month. There was a deadline, trying to correct it. And it was such a painful experience that I'm glad I looked at it, because this person didn't understand anything about American English. I mean, he thought Kent State, the university, was a state in the country, like Ohio or Nebraska. I mean, this was a seriously flawed translation. And I had to work and work and work. And so I became so sick of the whole thing. And I hope I never have to do it again. So I can only read myself in English, really. Hey, let's do one more. That's a terrible thing to think about. Yeah.
So I missed the first 3 minutes, so if you covered this, I apologize. But I'm going to go home with a beautiful, very large book of manuscript, and I wonder if you could say something about this book.
Oh, well, that's what we talked about in the beginning. I really don't want to bore everyone because they've sat through it.
Okay.
But it's just to tell you, there were many drafts of all three, and we arbitrarily picked a draft from each one of the three books. So, and I don't know which state each one is. I mean, whether it's early, middle, or late. I can guess, but I can't give you a clear answer.
Is the author's definitive edition of the novels or
No.
the manuscript?
No, it's a working manuscript, each one of three different books.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Please join me in
Thanks.
giving them a last round of applause.